There have been countless hauntings recorded all over the world, and many of these have managed to become rather famous. There are certain elements of the hauntings that make these cases stand out from the rest. One such haunting occurred in the 1980s, and it's gone on to be one of the most intense and controversial hauntings of all times. In 1986, the family of Carmen and Al Snedeker had fallen on pretty rough times. Their son had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, requiring extensive treatment at the hospital that drained the already struggling family financially. Making it worse was that they lived quite away from the only hospital in the region which was capable of providing the best care for their ailing son. And so they decided to rent a house in Southington, Connecticut, in order to be closer and make the constant commuting more bearable. At first, the house was a great deal, with reasonable rent and enough space for the family. It was a perfect location, and it all seemed too good to be true. Things got quite strange pretty much right away, when they were cleaning the dusty old basement and came across an array of morbid tools typically used by morticians, including embalming tables with blood drains, a trolley used for dead bodies to lay on, and various instruments that were used for cutting open dead bodies, as well as toe tags and personal belongings of the deceased, all just scattered and abandoned around the room. The curious couple looked into the history of the house and were rather unsettled to find that it had once been a funeral home called the Hallahan Funeral Home. Despite this creepy history, the basement was used as the bedroom for their two sons, and after cleaning it, the two boys moved in. The eldest son, Philip, the one who was sick, immediately from the first night complained of hearing strange noises and fluttering sounds in the dark, and seeing shadow figures and a man in a black and white pinstripe suit. The man had white hair and was lurking in the dark, just staring at him as he tried to unsuccessfully sleep. These paranormal disturbances got so bad that the boy begged to be allowed to stay in the hospital, as he was frightened of these entities and unable to sleep. He then began to display malicious behaviour, playing cruel jokes on his brothers and throwing tantrums for no reason, all while continuing to see the demonic forms that were tormenting him and apparently crawling into his head. The Snedekers believed that this was perhaps due to the stress from various treatments he'd been undergoing for his condition, so he was taken into hospital for the time being. The doctors did inform the family that none of the medication he was on should cause hallucinations. His parents would soon find out that this was not just their son's imagination. With Philip gone, whatever dark forces were in that house apparently turned their attention on the entire family. It started with a smell of what seemed to be rotting meat that would spring up out of nowhere, nauseating in its intensity, but they could not find the origin of it. After a short while, it would just disappear. The activity quickly escalated, with dishes put away by unseen hands, objects going missing only to reappear in strange places, lights turning on and off on their own, apparently even when the bulbs were taken out. Religious objects were a particular target for these entities, with crucifixes found bent out of shape, turned upside down or thrown to the floor. There were other odd, unsettling incidents as well. One day, Carmen was mopping the floor in the kitchen and claims that the water in the bucket suddenly turned a deep blood red colour and there was a terrible smell coming from it. Things would get steadily more terrifying when they would start seeing fleeting shadowy shapes in the home. Then they began to see the entity in the pinstripe suit that Philip had spoken about. Carmen also claimed to have seen a separate apparition with long black hair and black eyes. She said it was incredibly powerful, very thin with high cheekbones, long black hair and pitch black eyes. The entity Philip saw had white hair and eyes, wore a pinstripe tuxedo, and his feet were constantly in motion. This was seen by both her and her son. These spirits, demons, whatever they were, seemed to be extremely malevolent and malicious. Members of the family began to be pushed, prodded and tapped by unseen hands, and this graduated to punching, slapping and full-on assault when their niece was attacked by an invisible entity one evening that left her with scratch marks on her body and tore off the rosary she wore. Our Snedeker was also repeatedly attacked by the entities, and on one occasion, Carmen and her niece were surrounded by a dark mist that caused disorientation and paralysis while they were in the kitchen. In another frightening incident, Carmen claimed that as she was taking a shower, the curtain began to wrap around her face to the point she could barely breathe, only releasing her when her niece came to help. This was going on, their middle son, Matt, began experiencing strange personality shifts and violent behaviour similar to what Philip had experienced, as well as writing extremely dark and disturbing poetry featuring visions of murder and necrophilia. He began to brood in the corner, throwing tantrums, and even attacked his cousin Tammy on one occasion. This was enough for the family to have him moved temporarily to a mental institution for observation. They just couldn't cope with him any longer. That was when they would contact the world-famous paranormal researchers and demonologists, Ed and Lorranine Warren. The Warrens arrived at the house along with paranormal investigator John Zaffis and the rest of their team, where they would stay for the next 9 weeks. They were totally shocked at how intense the activity was, supposedly witnessing much of the phenomena for themselves, as well as the demonic attacks on the family. John Zaffis gave a detailed account of one terrifying incident. He said one night he was sitting at the dining room table reviewing some notes he had made. Suddenly, the room grew bitterly cold and he could sense a presence around him. He called out to the others who were sleeping in the living room, but he couldn't get anyone to wake up. He looked up the stairs and saw an apparition starting to form. The air was filled with a disgusting odour, so foul that he could hardly breathe. As the apparition took shape, he could hear a noise that sounded like thousands of flapping wings coming from behind it. He had never been more terrified in his life. The form slowly descended the stairs. It was the ugliest thing he had ever seen. It came to the last step and turned towards him and said, "Do you know what they did to us? Do you know?" All he wanted to do was get his car keys and get the hell out of that house. He did in fact leave the property and didn't return for 3 days. After experiencing a lot of the phenomena, Zaffis said that compared to that house, the other cases he had been involved with were like dealing with Casper the Friendly Ghost. The Warrens went on to claim that after looking into the history of the house and its past as a funeral home and mortuary, they were convinced that the morticians had been engaging in grim acts of necrophilia upon the corpses, even claiming to have found arrest records to this effect. This, they claimed, was the root of the problem, and that it had drawn demonic forces in. According to the Warrens, the house was absolutely infested with demons, and they decided to bring in Catholic priests to perform an exorcism on the property. The exorcism would last for over 3 hours and was plagued by all manner of violent paranormal activity, including dishes thrown about the room, banging on the walls, and intense waves of nauseous odours, which would frighten 2 of the priests off. Then finally, the house was said to be clear. The Snedekers would live there for another 2 years before moving out. The spectacular and harrowing story was heavily featured in the media at the time, and in later years would be turned into a book, documentary, and then a horror film called A Haunting in Conneticut, loosely based on the supposedly real events. However, like many of the cases the Warrens have covered, there has been a lot of scepticism aimed at the Snedeker family haunting. One major problem is the sheer amount of inconsistencies in the testimonies of both Carmen Snedeker and the Warrens. Details have changed on a regular basis, and it's sometimes hard to pin down exactly what happened and what the timeline for these events truly were, making it all rather shaky. There is also the fact that no one who has ever lived at the so-called haunted property before the Snedekers had ever experienced anything particularly odd there, nor has anyone who has lived there since. Neighbours at the time of the supposed terrifying events have claimed that nothing unusual was going on that they could tell. Adding to this is the detail that according to the local Catholic diocese, there are no records of an official exorcism having ever been carried out at the house. Adding fuel to the sceptical claims that the story was either partially or completely fabricated is a testimony of horror author Ray Garton, who was asked to write a book outlining the true events, which was titled In a Dark Place, The Story of a True Haunting. During the project, Garton, who went into it wanting to write a genuine non-fiction book on a real haunting, worked closely with the Snedekers and the Warrens, and he claims he found that they had trouble keeping their stories and versions of events straight, with numerous contradictions and inconsistencies. He also said the Warrens urged him to play fast and loose with the events, and in a rather damning interview he said, "It's hard writing a non-fiction book when all the people involved are telling you different stories." He found that the accounts of the individual Snedekers didn't quite match. They couldn't keep their stories straight. He went to Ed Warren with his problem and was told by Ed that the family were crazy, adding that all the people who came to see them are crazy, and asked if Ray truly thought that sane people would come to them. He told Ray that he had gotten some of the story and he should just use what worked and make the rest up. He was also told to make it scary, so that's what Ray did. He used what he could, made the rest up, and tried to make it as scary as he could. Despite all of this, the Snedekers have always stood by their story and insisted that none of it is fiction, as have the Warrens and John Zappis, leaving everyone to just wonder how much of it is true, if anything. In the meantime, the house where it all allegedly took place has become a bit of a macabre tourist attraction, much to the annoyance of the current owners. Whether any of it is true or not, the case of the Snedeker family haunting is a spectacular story, and it has obviously managed to maintain interest. Whether you believe any of it or not, there is no doubt that it has managed to retain its place among some of the most terrifying supposed hauntings on record. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.